Okay, let's begin. Welcome everyone to this Fertifa webinar on male fertility challenges and how to get support. I'm delighted to be joined by Major John O'Neill today, who we will do proper introductions with in a minute. It's a subject very close to his heart, and hopefully we'll have an insightful and impactful conversation with actionable insights. A few housekeeping points before we begin. As all our webinars, this webinar is recorded. You will get a recording after this call if you've missed it and you want to hear it back. We are going to have a Q&A at the end, but feel free to use the Q&A throughout the webinar. We want it to be as interactive as possible. Just a note that if you would like your question to be anonymous, make sure you tick the anonymous box so that it remains anonymous and that you're not using any identifiable information. You can also use the chat box if you want to share any comments throughout the webinar. I'm very, very excited for today. So I'm Céline. If you don't know me, I'm your host. I run the people function at Fertifa. If you're new to Fertifa, we're Europe's leading reproductive health benefits provider, and we work very closely with employers to create more inclusive and accessible workplaces for their employees. Like many of us at Fertifa, I have my own story with reproductive health with regards to pregnancy loss. I've also been a chief people officer for almost a decade now, so you can say I've experienced both sides of the reproductive health coin, and I'm hoping we have a really good conversation together today, especially as we're also tackling our experiences in very male-dominated environments. So John, you have such an interesting background. I would really appreciate if you took a moment to introduce yourself, and I'm sure I'll have lots of questions about your experience throughout, but over to you, Major John O'Neill.
Thank you very much indeed. And for the purpose of any conversation that I have in regard to fertility, it's absolutely not Major John O'Neill. I am just Jono. One of the experiences that I've had throughout, particularly when working within defence and supporting individuals on fertility journeys, is that fertility issues, they don't respect rank. They don't respect gender. They don't respect your social background, your sexuality, your religion. So these conversations are equally as important and impactful for anyone, no matter what their background. In terms of me, I've been an army officer now since 2012. I'm currently serving within the Royal Military Police, and when we talk about male-dominated organisations, I absolutely come from one of those. When I went through my fertility journey, I was working in an even more male-dominated environment than I am now. I was attached at the time to the Royal Marines. So in terms of male and stereotypically masculine organisations, I don't think there's too many on the planet which would really rival that. In terms of why I'm sat here and speaking to everyone today, and I genuinely really appreciate the fact that people have given up their lunch to log on and have a listen to my experiences and journey, and hopefully I can provide some decent insights. The main reason I'm here is effectively because I have what's called low levels of sperm morphology and motility. So in layman's terms, effectively, I have dodgy shaped swimmers that are a little bit lazy. Now, if you've logged on at lunchtime and you're feeling slightly uncomfortable that a middle-aged man is talking to you about the quality of his sperm, then get it. Completely understand. Male infertility, by its very nature, is still a taboo subject and something that people find quite difficult to talk about. You've only got to look at the way it's portrayed in media and Hollywood with regard to the fact that it becomes a difficult subject. I'm a huge fan of the comedy series Scrubs. And within that, there was a scene where Turk was told that he might have issues with regard to fertility, and it cut away to him in an image of him in the shower shaking, going, "I am a man and men are supposed to have babies." And equally from the series Suits, when Lewis Litt is required to have a sperm test conducted, his inspirational material that he takes in with him when he needs to do the deed happens to be a copy of the Financial Times. So generally speaking, when male infertility is portrayed, it is in either a comedic way, which is understandable, it is a coping strategy, but it's also always a slightly uncomfortable one. There's also a fairly unhelpful narrative that virility is linked to masculinity. And the best example I can give for that is when I was trawling through YouTube to try and find resources to support individuals in the network that I represent. I got very excited because a very prominent influencer had put a video up where they were doing a sperm test. I was thinking, brilliant, somebody with a huge reach, millions of followers having a conversation about this, until I went onto that video and discovered that the video itself was him and his lackeys having a competition for who had the greatest sperm count. And videos like that are really unhelpful. And that's twofold. The first one is it presents a false picture that the bigger your sperm count, the more manly you are, which is not helpful to start with. But also, you can have a very high sperm count. I do, and all still have fertility issues.
Yeah.
So that's just the sort of start point I come from.
No, wonderful.
Yeah, I've had my own fertility journey, which I know
Yes.
Céline will be asking me about in a minute. But as a result of that, at the end of it, I've subsequently was really passionate about supporting others in this position, and as such, volunteered for a role that I currently do now, which is one of the co-leads of the Defence Fertility Network.
Wonderful. And I'm really excited to talk to you about that. We have about 3 chapters to our conversations, let's say. So the first one around the emotional and physical impact of fertility challenges on men. The second is really what kind of supports can we have available from your experience, also our experience. And finally, how to support a successful workplace fertility network. Before we do that, though, we do love data at Fertifa. So we have a couple of polls here, which I'm going to launch. And if I may ask everyone to participate, now that we have everyone here, it would be great. So question number 1 is, do you have an understanding of male fertility challenges and what they can look like? And question number 2 is, does your workplace offer fertility support for male employees as well as female employees? So I'm going to give it a couple of seconds. Can you see the results with me, John? Or, okay, no, I'm gonna have to share with you, no problem. So let me tell you what it looks like at the moment. Just waiting, a couple more people are gonna vote, so we have a maximum. Perfect. So question number 1, do you have an understanding of male fertility? So 50% said no, 15% I'm not sure, and well, now it's changed a bit, 38% yes. So as you were saying, there's still kind of a lot of education to be had. Second, does your workplace offer fertility support for male as well as female employees? Almost 60% are a no, and 17% not sure. So I think this conversation will be very helpful. Thank you, everyone. So starting with, I guess, the first premise of the emotional and the physical impact that having reproductive health challenges can have, namely fertility in this case. Can you tell us first about your own story, working, as you said, in the most male-dominated environment in the world, how that happened, how did you experience that?
So I'll start off by highlighting that being in the military comes with some additional challenges. No 2 fertility journeys are the same. So the first one of those challenges is the fact that quite often we're expected to deploy for long periods of time away from our partners, and clearly it's very hard to conceive naturally if both partners aren't there. And the second one is the issue is that we are required to move usually about every 2 to 3 years, which presents a challenge of trying to transfer between NHS providers. So we've managed to transfer our treatment from Essex down to a hospital in Plymouth on my assignment down to work with the Royal Marines. We'd identified that the issue predominantly was sitting with me due, as I said, to my sperm quality. And because of that, we had been recommended a treatment called ICSI. So there's a slight difference between your traditional IVF and ICSI. So IVF effectively is where they will hyperstimulate the ovaries of the female, try and extract as many eggs as physically possible, and then they'll take a sample from the male and let nature take its course, and then do implantation of viable embryos. The difference with ICSI is instead of letting nature take its course, they will individually select a sperm cell and inject it into the egg in order to try and ensure that they're achieving the best possible one. So that, from a treatment perspective, is where I was. But the ability to have a sensible conversation as a male about this can be quite difficult. Generally speaking, and I'm going to be incredibly stereotypical here, so you'll have to forgive me, but in my experience, have found that females are far more eloquent and mature about speaking about this subject. So if one female turns around to another and says, "We're struggling to conceive because we've got low levels of progesterone or low ovarian reserve," um, then generally speaking, the person they're speaking to will turn around and say, "Do you want to go have a cup of tea and talk about it?" Where if, as a male, and I've got experience of this, we deal with things less maturely and often with inappropriate humor. So I don't think I'll be the first male that turned around and said, "We're struggling to conceive. It's down to my sperm quality." And a mate of mine turned around and said, "Send her around my way, mate. I'll sort her out for you." Now, don't get me wrong, that's how we can deal with things, but it's also at some point you want to have that sensible conversation. So when I went through my experience, I wasn't aware that we had a support network within Defence. At the time, it was an unofficial one. I only discovered it afterwards. And because of that, it was strange because on the one hand, in terms of my family, I had everybody pretty much knowing what was happening during a process that's usually intrinsically private. You tend not to tell your family that you are trying for a baby when you're trying to conceive naturally. You tell them at about the 3 month point of the pregnancy when you know it's fairly secure.
Absolutely.
But because your family wish to be supportive during this process, they know when every step is happening and they want to know because they've got the very best hopes for you. But the flip side of that was from a professional point of view, it wasn't something that I openly discussed. It wasn't something I wanted people to be aware about. Um, I ended up being in a position where I had to talk about it because there was conversations about me being assigned early. And because of that, I had to declare the fact that we had this medical treatment going on in the background and us moving could strongly impact that, if not completely undermine my marriage. So off the back of that, I had to confide in my commanding officer at the Royal Marines. And I've got to be honest, the level of support that I provided was unbelievable. Absolutely superb. He fought absolutely tooth and nail to keep me within the unit and within the location and succeeded in doing so. And it's something I'm incredibly grateful for to this day. It was at this point that because I had to involve other members of my chain of command, that I actually started realizing that the position I was in was not uncommon in the slightest. I found out that my direct line manager, my officer commanding, had both his children via support. I found out the second in command of the unit had recently had a child via support, and we had an Australian exchange officer who was a very good friend of mine who was a test tube baby. And when you start realizing that it's less common, it's a lot less lonely. From that point, I decided to confide in my sergeant major, who is effectively my second in command. And when you hear sergeant major, you don't think of the most cuddly individual. But once again, the level of support I was given by that person was absolutely brilliant once I started having sensible and meaningful conversations. In the end, I made the tough decision to tell my entire troop of Royal Marines, I had 38 of them working to me, that I was about to undergo that process. I realized that there was a likelihood when we came to implantation that I was going to be grumpy. I wouldn't be the normal line manager. And I honestly believe that if you can stand up in front of a group of 38 Royal Marines and tell them about that particular issue, there should be no circumstances in life where it's a difficult conversation because it should be that open. The number of teas and coffees that got brought to my door over the next 2 weeks without being asked for went through the roof. That was from my most junior lance corporal through to my more senior ranks. And when we were incredibly fortunate and did conceive, and I was able to announce that we had reached that 3 month part where the pregnancy was relatively secure, I was instructed to get into one of our conference rooms immediately, at which point I was presented a baby blanket in Royal Marine colours and was told, "Boss, we know you're a dirty, stinking pongo," which is Royal Marine slang for those of us in the army. But your little one was conceived in the Corps, so we're claiming it for the Royal Marines. And that is probably one of the few times that I've pretty much almost been reduced to tears.
Oh, that's
But the
such a
so
lovely
what,
story. Such a
the
lovely
so
story.
what from all of that is that I felt like I couldn't have a conversation.
Yeah.
I felt like I was alone.
Mhm.
And particularly as a man, I think there are additional barriers to have that conversation. But once you start having it, you just realize how much more common it is, and it makes the journey, in my opinion, a lot easier.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, it's an amazing story. And, it takes a lot of courage, especially in the environments that you described, even though it sounds like you did get very good support, from the people, which is very nice to hear. And good to see that in any environment, people step up. But I think you highlight something really important in that whether men or women are going through fertility challenges, it's an incredibly isolating experience initially because you think you're the only one. And we know from, surveys done by the Fertility Network that, more than 95% of people say it affects their mental health. So it's a huge number. So I think we have to be there to support people through the challenges, and as well the partner, because as you were saying as well, usually there's a lot of attention on the other partner, which of course is right, but often we forget the men in the equation who are also suffering, also grieving when a loss is happening. So I think that's very, very important. So apart from sharing with your unit, sharing with your commander, were there other things that helped you with the impact emotionally that was going on? Obviously, you had a very positive outcome in that your lovely daughter Iris was born, so that's great. But until you got to that point, what other avenues were you using for support? If you can tell me a little bit more about that.
No, absolutely. So I think we were very lucky that we had a strong family network, which was absolutely critical because during a lot of our investigative elements of our treatment, and actually when we were going through the treatment itself, we were still in the midst of COVID. So the ability to go for a beer with a mate or have that offload wasn't available. So conversations across a screen like the one we're having today was actually more common in terms of where we were at. Um, one of the areas that I will absolutely highlight is that within the process, my wife absolutely did the vast majority of the heavy lifting. There was a lot of occasions where she was required to, due to COVID restrictions, to attend appointments on her own, and I'd be sat outside in a car park. And thankfully, we've moved on from that in terms of the COVID-19 protocols. Um, so in terms of the support that was available, it was predominantly family members that I was having those conversations with at distance. But also my wife and I, we did speak about it often. It was one thing so I always say is that if you've got a individual or couple that is going through a fertility journey, it's not an important thing in their life. It is the only thing in their life. There is very little else that they'll be focusing on at that point. So having workplace support in place to try and support individuals and have an understanding is absolutely critical. And I look at myself on that because when I was a very young platoon commander in his late 20s, I had one of my corporals come to my door and say that he was going through his own fertility journey. Now, I thought I was the best line manager in the world because I made sure that I afforded him all the time off that he needed to attend his appointments. And I made sure all the paperwork for his funding was signed off because we have a slightly different route in the military. Not once did I ask him, do you want to grab a brew and have a chat? Now, to a degree, I can be heavily critical on myself on that.
Yeah,
But as a late 20s individual not looking to start a family, I didn't understand. And it's
absolutely.
about having those conversations and allowing people to um, have an insight. They're never going to fully understand. You're not going to unless you've been through it. But if you can have an insight, it will make our line managers better at supporting their people.
Absolutely. It's so important. And we actually have a question in the chat, which is very, very important as well. How can we encourage men to speak up more and ask for support?
It's a really good question. It's something we're still working on, and I'm slightly straying into one of our other chapters, Celine, so you'll forgive me. But um, one of the areas that we've been looking at is just having those conversations. I think one of there are organisations out there which are male only, and I think having a space for men to have open conversations is really healthy so they can speak to other men in the same situation. So having a location where you know that you'll dial into a meeting, whether it's by Zoom or Teams, where you're speaking to other people that have been through the same experience and there's no judgment associated with it or no perceived judgment, is absolutely huge. And one organization that we have done work with previously, who are excellent for this, is Fertility, which is a subsidiary of Fertility Network UK.
Okay.
It was set up by the comedian Rod Gilbert, who was very open with regard to his own fertility journey, and having role models and people openly having those conversations absolutely helps. But it's about providing men the opportunity to have those conversations, I think, with each other. Anecdotally, and this is just my experience, is I've found that most men that I've engaged with who've wanted to have a discussion in this area prefer to have it more one-on-one than in
Yeah.
a group chat or on a Facebook question and so forth. They prefer having that confidence. It's a single person that they're talking to, but that's purely off my experience.
Yeah, no, that's really good insight. So I think you mentioned something really important in terms of support. And obviously at Fertifa, when we work with employers and their employees, something that is very powerful, especially when you're going through such a vulnerable time. And at the beginning, when you're given so much information, is really the power of education, right? So understanding what is happening to you, understanding what your options are, understanding, how you can take control. So how did that happen to you when you first were told about what was happening within, I guess, your physical challenges? Where did you go for information, and how did that journey of education happen?
So I've got to think back now. So once we established what the issues were, I did what most people do, which is use Dr. Google. That's where a lot of information is available. And I think I was quite fortunate because there's a lot out there, and I've very quickly discovered some of the organisations like Fertifa, Fertility UK, and others that have got fact sheets provided that are relatively accurate. Again, I was in that position where, because it was COVID, couldn't physically go and see somebody beyond the actual medical practitioners that we had. But a lot of it was the information that I found was very much process orientated. What was next? We also had the challenge of going through the military policy in order to access treatment, because we don't use an NHS GP. We go through medical officers and trying to work out how that happened. And it can be quite a confusing process, which is why our network does a lot of the work that it does. In terms of the emotional support, I think initially, until I started having genuine conversations, particularly with my sergeant major, who was my workplace confidant, for want of a better expression, I felt incredibly guilty because I was in a position where I was seeing my wife going through these absolutely horrendous investigations and procedures, and it was due to a medical condition that I had. So she went through a procedure which was incredibly painful for her called a hycosis, where they were looking at her fallopian tubes, the number of injections that she was having in order to control her cycle and promote the hyperstimulation of the ovaries, um, multiple injections every day. And as a male, you feel very helpless. Now, I'm not going to turn around here and say that I had it worse than my wife. That's absolutely not the case. And I don't think it's helpful to try and work out who has it worse within the process. What I think is absolutely critical is you will find that the vast majority of fertility providers want to treat the couple, not the individual. And if that can be looked at from a workplace perspective as well, and having that understanding that when a female partner is going for a appointment or test, the male partner is naturally want to go as well. You need to afford them that time to do so, is absolutely critical to ensuring they're part of the process. They have agency, and what that means is they're in a better place to A, be better at work, B, be better in terms of being a partner, and C, being better at actually going through the process themselves. So it's a win-win if you can put that in place.
Absolutely. So what we're talking about really is having very clear policies that recognize that, the male partner will also need the time off, will also need that emotional support, to be able to bring their best selves to work, essentially, because otherwise, as you say, when they're going through fertility, that is their number one priority, because it does take all of your emotional energy, physical energy, and financial resources as well. So it does have a huge, huge impact on us. So the final point around the support available, obviously, you and I, we've both had positive outcomes. I've had pregnancy loss, I've had a molar pregnancy, but eventually I did have my family, so it was very positive. However, through that, individuals are going through several grieving situations or processes where they are grieving, and that is really hard to go through, especially in environments where you're not sure where you can go, who you can speak to. What advice do you have for people who might be in that situation, or for employers who have employees going through that situation, to help people going through that process?
So the guidance I'd first have is that a loss, whether that is a day after implantation, if it is part term, full term, or post birth, is a loss. One of the anecdotally, a very good friend of mine who went through a fertility journey, after an implantation, I think they lost it after a matter of 4 to 6 weeks, and a family member turned around and said, "Okay, well, at least it's happened now and not later on down the journey." Now, that individual did not mean any malice in that conversation whatsoever. They were trying to be supportive. But for the individual that's going through the journey, whether it's via a fertility support or it's through a natural pregnancy, it is an absolute loss for that individual, and they need time to grieve. The army's is recognizing this. Have to say that they're in a positive place on this. They signed the pregnancy loss pledge, I believe it was last year. And we also have an absolutely incredible volunteer network, which is called the Defence Child Bereavement Network, which exists to provide support to couples and individuals that are in that space. So I think it's the key element of that is whether or not it's been one day or it is post-birth, it is a loss for that individual, and it should not be trivialized based on how far through the pregnancy it is.
Absolutely. And you mentioned something really important, is that the intentions of people are often positive, but because they haven't been educated, they have sometimes a very significant impact on the person going through those challenges. So whichever place you work at, spending a little bit of time to help, whether managers or humans, really understand how to respond to people going through that kind of grief, goes a long, long way. So thank you for sharing that. Any other type of support before we move to the next section? Anything practical that you found helpful throughout your journey, or anything you'd like to mention? Maybe it's just within your own kind of sector or more in general.
Without spilling over into talking about the network, because I think we're talking about that a little bit later on.
In literally 30 seconds.
Roger. No, I think one of the key elements is also the organization actually having a policy was useful,
Yes,
even though the policy absolutely required greater improvement. When I say it required greater improvement, and still to a degree does cause a lot of questions of how you go through each step to provide the access that it enables, to provide the stability that it enables, and so forth. But also in terms of the language within the policy. I'll give an example. The policy has changed, but when I went through my journey, it stated within it that fertility treatment was an elective procedure, and as such, there was no availability of leave accordingly. Now, what it meant by it being an elective procedure is that it wasn't a requirement to enable a person to deploy. So a treatment which is required in terms of knee surgery, whatever it might be, is an absolute requirement for that. But as the individual and end user reading that fertility is considered elective is quite dispassionate. And you could tell it had been written by a medical professional and an administrator. I am sure it was absolutely well intentioned, but it's a kind of a kick in the teeth when you read language like that when you're in that position.
absolutely, absolutely. And we say this when we work with people and employers at Fertifa all the time. At least start to have a policy. It probably won't be the right policy that you're going to end up with, but start the conversation and then iterate on the language, iterate on the groups of people that you have, get some insight, and make sure that it's a living and breathing document. Because as we said at the beginning, no experience is the same, and the more people go through these experiences, the more they can add to what is needed on the practical side or emotional side. And so that's super important. So I'm really excited about our final bit, because people come to us all the time and say, we don't have any budget, what can we do tomorrow that's actionable, that's impactful, without really spending any money? And I think what you've done with the Defence Fertility Network is super impressive and also very interesting as a case study. So I'd love to hear more about what it is. I know you came into it and it was already existing, but then it was amplified. Some of your learnings, and tell us more about that.
No, fantastic. So once we'd finished our fertility journey, we'd had my little one, my daughter Iris, who's now 2.5. I reflected on my experience. I reflected on the way that I felt, and I was there thinking it'd be fantastic if a network existed that supported individuals going through what I've been through. At which point, a friend of mine said, "There is one," which is really unhelpful after the fact. Um, but that's the way things work. I made contact with three absolutely incredible women. We've got Laura and Rachel, who are members of the Royal Navy, and Sadie, who is an officer in the RAF. And they had set up an informal, by informal, I mean it wasn't recognised by Defence at the time, network on Facebook that existed for the purpose of providing support to individuals. I got in contact, and I still remember the conversation with Rachel. She was particularly excited to speak with me on two areas. First one was that I was Army, and they didn't have an Army rep at the time. But the second one was that I was a bloke happy to talk about fertility, because in my anecdotal experience, the vast majority of conversations about this are very much female orientated and female attended. So I got involved. It must have been 2 or 3 years, 2 years ago now, and we made the major step of being recognised as an official network under Defence in February 2021. At the time, we had about 135 members, which is, for a workplace network, is a great start in any capacity. But upon going official and our ability to then communicate across the entirety of the organization, our membership is now over 800. I don't say that necessarily with a sense of pride, because it's a double-edged sword. I really wish that our membership was zero and nobody was in the position where they had to undergo a fertility journey. However, the fact that we have that number of people who are willing to talk about it within Defence is incredibly positive, and means that we have several advantages that comes with having significant numbers. The first of those is it supports our initial purpose for setting up the network, which is peer support. We wanted people, whether they are serving or so the network itself, it is available to members of the Army, Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, and civil servants that work for Defence, but also their partners. So if there's a civilian partner who also wants to be included, we are absolutely open to them as well. Having the larger numbers gives us the ability to provide real peer support. I said earlier that there's no two fertility journeys that are exactly the same, and I stand by that. But there's often commonalities in terms of what treatment did you try? How did you find this experience? And for us in the military, right, what's next in the policy? Who do I need to sign this box? Who do I need to send it on to? And it's for people to have the ability to ask questions, whether anonymously, and we do make sure there's the ability to do that, or otherwise, gives them the option to ask questions they may not be able to find the answers to elsewhere. And generally speaking, because of the size of our network, there's somebody that's had some experience that's similar, and our membership are incredible. There's always generally somebody that's willing to share, which is incredibly positive. The second benefit of having that network scale is the ability to advocate, because you have that mass of people to be able to turn around to, for us, the chain of command or line management, and say, okay, based on the feedback we're getting from our membership, this is how you can improve policy and improve things to make people's lived experience far better. I think the real learning point for me, going back to that entire piece about no fertility journey being the same, is the amount I've learned in terms of inclusivity. So I have got, obviously, I'm in a heterosexual relationship, and before getting involved with the network, I was completely oblivious, for example, of the challenges of same-sex couples going through this process. and I'm now far more abreast of policy in that area than I possibly would have done. One of the areas we are doing a fair amount of work trying to increase our understanding at the moment is for single-sex male couples going through surrogacy. Again, that's a topic that isn't particularly well known or spoken about. I had no insight with regards to individuals that wanted to have a child and were going through the process. And we are very privileged in the fact that we have people from the vast majority of these communities who are part of our network and willing to talk about it. And that's incredibly positive because I cannot necessarily fully relate to people in that position. So having those members that can and provide that insight is absolutely critical. And lastly, what's fallen out of it is the ability to talk at senior levels and with senior management. So I've had the privilege of briefing from unit health fairs, from private soldiers who've never even considered fertility challenges, all the way up to the military secretary who is a two-star general. And I don't expect people to walk away being experts in all elements of fertility. There's a lot of really important causes, a lot of incredible networks doing great work. What is important is they know where to turn when they want to get that information or that insight.
That's amazing. Really, really great. And I can tell the impact that this network is having, and also all the learnings that you've had and how to, pay it forward and continue scaling it. And I think this brings up a few interesting questions, including one that was posed in our Q&A. So workplace support is obviously very important. It's very impactful, but how do you get started? Do employees set it up and run it? Is it best to come from top down? Because from our experience, it is so important to have that leadership buy-in. And I think that's something that you mentioned. I think obviously for you, the turning point was receiving the official status that also gave, not the authority, but in a way the authority to be able to be a standalone entity and go to maybe leadership with feedback or surveys or anything that you've had, whether it's data or personal stories, to have actionable change. What's your view on I guess the sequencing? Should employees set it up, or what happened for you specifically in the Defence Fertility Network? Was it started by just employees and then they got the buy-in?
Absolutely. So it was initially started by Rachel and Sadie. So one of my RF and one of our Royal Navy colleagues. They actually met on a online forum, not related to defence. And when one person in the military talks to another person in the military, you tend to know they're in the military. It's a really bizarre sort of sixth sense that we have. But they clued onto the fact that they were both there and realised that there wasn't a network to provide that support. I think the reality is that if you want something to have drive and momentum behind it, you need individuals that are passionate about the subject. And generally speaking, there's not going to be many people more passionate than those that are going through that process or that journey. And I should have said that all of us who are co-leads of the organization, so the network, we've all been through our own journeys, so have our various perspectives, backgrounds, but also a passion to support others going through it. I think it's a case of, if you want to be able to demonstrate to an organization that something's important, you need to show that it is impacting an element of their organization and have that illustration as to why it's important, not just to those specific individuals, but to the organization itself. I will happily turn around and say that my continued service in the armed forces has been incredibly positively influenced by the level of support that I had. The fact that my commanding officer acted in the way that he did, I was spoken to as a human being, I was given the support that I needed. It's beneficial to the workplace as much as it is to the individual going long term. So I think your driving factor is always going to be the fact that you need a core of individuals that want to drive something and push it forward. I then think in terms of workplace support, I would suggest that the most critical part is, what is the organization's policy so people's expectations are met? Is there time off being afforded for people to attend fertility appointments? What is the pregnancy loss policy that is there if the worst should happen? What levels of pastoral support are available to those individuals going through? And then working out, is there any other avenues that can be explored to provide additional support? So in the military, I've spoke at the start about the challenges that we face because we consistently have to move. The positive we get off the back of that is, by virtue of the fact that we have to move, we have access to whatever the maximum number of cycles of IVF or ICSI is in the UK at that particular point in time. So we are kind of immune from the postcode lottery. but making sure that's communicated is absolutely critical, because I wasn't completely aware of that until I got directed to somebody else who knew the policy better than I did. So I think it's about making sure you have those policies, but also making sure they're accessible as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we always say as well for the language also to be, as direct, as clear, as simple as possible, because it can be confusing sometimes reading through medical jargon. And so that's really important. Thank you for that. So really to answer the question, it's kind of a collaboration between employees who are extremely passionate, who set up a work group with clear goals, have a real understanding as to what they want to achieve through it, get the buy-in, get the opt-in from other people as well, and be a voice for change, but with a real bias to action. So that's really how I would summarize what you just said. I'm just curious, John, because you went from 135 to 800, right? So that's a huge number, a huge increase in scale. How do you manage all these members, and how often do you meet? How is it organized? Is it through a Facebook group? Can you tell us a little bit more about, I guess, the logistics of setting that up?
So I'd say about 95% of our activity is on our Facebook group. It's a private group, but the number of questions that we ask in order for someone to access are not vast. It's mainly checking that somebody is a member of Defence and that they are undergoing a fertility journey, which is why people come to it in the first place. Um, sorry, excuse me.
No worries.
Um, and in terms of that, what we do is as admins and also under the people who wish to highlight stuff, we will throw it out there as many resources that are available to us. Because I think one of the key elements of this is not try and do everything yourself. There is a huge number of organizations doing a massive amount of work. We've mentioned a couple of them. And we will highlight webinars like this by Fertifa. We will highlight webinars by Fertility Network UK, Him Fertility, Test Him, Two Dads, LBGT Mummies. There are just so many positive organizations that are out there. And the approach that we'll take on that is we don't really care who you speak to, as long as you speak to somebody and you get the answers that you need. So there's a lot of signposting that happens on there. We are checking. So myself and the other three admins, we make sure that questions go up on a daily basis. If we can provide an immediate answer, we will do. If not, we'll put it out to the forum and see if somebody else can provide that level of insight. We've done a number of in-person events, but as you can imagine, with a global workforce, and even in the UK, it's incredibly spread. Trying to get everybody together in one location can be quite difficult. So we've had coffee mornings at RAF Cranwell, and sorry, Yvonne, I've just seen your question, and yes, I'll happily share all the links. That's not a problem in the slightest. Sorry, excuse me. Where was I going? So yeah, so with regard to that element on there, but what we've also done is, because that's very much targeted at individuals who are going through the fertility journeys themselves, there's two other cohorts we need to consider. The first of those are individuals that don't want to declare on Facebook that they're going through a fertility journey and they wish to have a level of privacy, and also management and administrators, to make sure that they have a portal they can go to. So we have what we call Defence Connect, which is essentially a SharePoint page. We don't monitor that to the same degree with regard to forums and so forth, but it is a landing page which includes links to all the policy for defence, as much policy as we can find from the NHS, the NICE, useful guidance documents from charitable organisations, and points of contact that people can engage with. So we've got that central landing page where you don't have to join the Facebook group, don't have to declare anything, and you can go onto there. I think the biggest challenge which we've got at the moment goes back to the male piece, unfortunately. As an organisation, the armed forces is, depending which one you're looking at, between 85 and 90%, 99 and 92% male. I think I've got those figures right. They may be slightly off, so please don't hold me to account on them. But in terms of the membership of our network, it is still 80% female, 20% male. So I think we've still got work to do in the male area in terms of accessibility and encouraging people to do so. But we are working on that. The other key element is working with our wider organizational signposters. Once we went official, which is didn't really change what we did overnight, but was a nice to have. What that did was give us access to the absolute behemoth that is all of defence social media platforms. So the Army announced that we were there. We were the front page story on the Army website that day. We were on all of the respective launched on all the respective services, Instagrams, Twitter, all that sort of stuff, which had exposure. And I think the reason the memberships increased, we tend to see little surges, and that's because there's been a briefing that's been conducted, or there's been a health fair and we've been represented, and people talk. And it's the more people that talk and talk that generate that level of insight. The one thing I would say, as just a temperance warning, is you are always going to get individuals negatively commenting. And to a degree, it's just best to ignore it. When the Army launched, there was a few comments on Instagram from individuals putting on there, "This is the British Army. Why are we talking about fertility? I didn't follow the British Army to see this sort of nonsense." And I just let that roll off our backs, because
Yeah,
they're not the people that I'm interested in.
of
The
course.
people I'm interested in are those going through the journey.
Absolutely. And if anything, it shows you how much education needs to happen, which usually these people think they don't need it, but they need it the most. So thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to go to the Q&A next, but first I want to say thank you so much for all the detail, for all the experience. It's just
Absolute
so
pleasure.
humbling and lovely to see you turn such a vulnerable journey in an impactful kind of paying it forward to other people, and I'm sure you're helping so many people yourself with Sadie and the rest of the Defence Fertility Network. So if you would like to ask a question, you can pop it in the Q&A box. Thank you for all the questions already, and just to make sure it's anonymous, make sure you tick that anonymous. So we have one question. We're looking at drafting our fertility policy and wanted to ask where the best place to start is. What are the must-haves in a fertility policy? So
Oh, wow.
I think we've answered a little bit. I guess from the Fertifa angle, I can just begin. So starting is already great. So well done for wanting to start your fertility policy. I think it's important to make sure that you are inclusive, not only in your language, but also in the groups that you are speaking to within the policy. As we said, making sure we are considering single parents, making sure we are considering LGBTQIA, making sure we are considering, the option of surrogacy. So very important to be as inclusive as possible, knowing that you can always add more information as you get more educated on the topic. The second thing that you mentioned as well is to be very clear on what is the process within the policy, what are the different steps. I guess it sounds very more onerous on your side as well, with all the approvals that are needed to get through that. But very simply, in terms of, am I allowed to book time off? How much time off am I allowed to book? If we have internal systems, how do I book it in the system? So be very practical and clear. And I think the final thing from our side is really, using inclusive and simple language as much as possible to be able, to help people navigate that. I would really also advise to survey your population, because as we said, no journeys are the same. Even for us, or for me, speaking from the eye, going through, having had a molar pregnancy, I can't assume that someone else who has a molar pregnancy will go through exactly the same thing, because we're very different experiences and individuals. So survey your population, ask about what they need, what helps the most, and I guess keep that flexibility in there to be able to cater as well on a case-by-case basis. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just to reinforce engagement with the population, absolutely key. And that's one of the areas that we're being used far more for now, is when redrafts of policy are happening, we're being seen as a critical friend, because having that level of insight to make sure that the policy is, first of all, understandable and accessible is absolutely critical. But also seek guidance. I don't own the policy. I am not a policy writer. We're just the
Yeah.
individuals that try and help develop it.
Absolutely, that's great advice. One more question before we close. So, which I think is a very interesting question and very relevant to what we're talking about. So, what advice would you give to an HR team working in a male-dominated environment, trying to convince senior leadership that this is important?
If you've got the ability to find someone who can share and is willing to share their experiences in an open and honest forum, I think it's really impactful. Um, I appreciate that it's sometimes difficult to find a male that is willing to do so, which is completely understandable. And if that's not the case, then I would suggest engagement with an organization that might be able to provide that insight on their behalf, whether that's Fertifa, Céline mentioned Fertility Network UK. They do a lot with regard to the male sphere. They had three individuals recently climb up to Everest Base Camp to highlight male infertility. There's a phenomenal individual called Toby Trice, who is a motor racing driver who does a campaign called Drive for Fertility, who talks about his experiences. But I think putting the human face on it is the way to try and bring people on board, and try and humanize it in a way that it makes sure that fertility is a medical condition in exactly the same way that any other medical condition is, and people just need that level of support when they're going through that process and that journey.
Absolutely. I think that's really good advice. And I would add to that, something you've already mentioned is really showing the organizational impact or the business impact that it has on people working, whether it is retention or engagement or the fact that they're going to have to take time off. If you support them, that they actually will be better off and be a more productive employee is hugely valuable to leadership teams who obviously want to make sure that their businesses are not affected or as little as possible. Wonderful. So to summarize, male fertility challenges and how to get support. So we talked about the emotional and physical impact. It's not just a female issue. Men need support as well. The huge importance of education in this and in the types of support. We went through the different measures that exist, really clear policies, creating a safe space, which from your experience has been, really more one-to-one when it comes to men. Companies like Fertifa, and finally, the impactful nature of setting up an employee group successfully, which you've done amazingly with the Defence Fertility Network, making sure that you have specific goals here, you get buy-in, you really have a bias to action, that you have open and honest conversations, and that you regularly survey your population as well. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, just to say thank you very much. I absolutely am aware that talking about male fertility issues can be uncomfortable. So I'm really grateful for your time in terms of having that, and I really hope it's been of use.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful speaking to you, John, and really grateful for your time as well. I have put a little note in the chat. If anyone's looking to support their employees, you can book a call, and we will follow with all the amazing insights and information that you shared on this call as well for people to be able to use. So thank you everyone for joining, and the recording will be circulated as well. So have a good day, and thank you again, Major John O'Neill. Bye.